Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up today, President Trump threatens Hamas, saying if the group doesn't disarm, they'll be disarmed. We ask what to read into that and how might Hamas respond. Plus, as Israeli families continue waiting for Hamas to hand over the remains of their loved ones, we ask what's causing the delay and could this issue derail the whole peace plan? Hello and welcome to the programme. We continue our special coverage of the Gaza ceasefire. Well, Israel says that one of the 4 bodies handed over by Hamas overnight does not match any of the known hostages. Well, under the first phase of the Gaza peace plan, Hamas was required to return all 48 remaining hostages. And so far, all 20 living hostages have been handed over, together with the bodies of 7 others. Well, in response to delays in handing over the bodies, Israel has threatened to restrict aid into Gaza and delay the reopening of the Rafah border crossing. Well, President Trump has once again reiterated his demand that the deceased hostages held in Gaza be returned. And he once again warned Hamas that if they do not disarm, they will be disarmed.
How long will it take Hamas to disarm, and can you guarantee that is going to happen?
Well, they're going to disarm, and because they said they were going to disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them.
How will you do that?
I don't have to explain that to you. But if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. They know I'm not playing games. Okay? Now, we did something monumental. We got the hostages back. That was the first thing we had to do. Above all else, get the hostages back. Now, they misrepresented because we were told they had 26, 24 of dead hostages, if we can use those terms. And it seems as though they don't have that because we're talking about a much lesser number.
Well, Israel is insisting that Hamas is failing to meet its commitments under the ceasefire deal, citing the number of deceased hostages still in Gaza. And because of that, Israel says it will only allow 300 aid trucks in. That's just half the minimum agreed under President Trump's plan. But Hamas and the Red Cross say that finding bodies in Gaza, whether hostages or Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes, is not that simple with so much destruction and rubble across the Gaza Strip. Well, despite efforts to implement the ceasefire, Israeli troops remain deployed across more than half of Gaza, with reports of Hamas fighters reappearing on the streets. Well, asked about those realities, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he was giving peace a chance. Here's what he told CBS News.
We agreed to give peace a chance. We agreed that we should, the conditions in his 20-point plan are very clear. It's not only that we get the hostages out without getting our military out, but that we would subsequently have both demilitarization and disarmament. They're not the same thing. First, Hamas has to give up its arms. And second, you want to make sure that there are no weapons factories inside Gaza. There's no smuggling of weapons into Gaza. But if not, I think I heard the president speak tonight. He said, listen, they better do it, or, how can I speak for him? He said, all hell breaks loose.
Well, here with me in the studio now is Hashem Osseiran, who's an ICRC spokesperson. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. The ICRC, of course, calling for all crossings into Gaza to be opened. What are the main needs on the ground as you see them?
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is still catastrophic. The ceasefire is only the beginning. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. People need medicine, they need food, they need safe water, but they also need more complex items for the repair of water and electricity networks, for the repair of hospitals, spare parts for generators, parts for ambulances. So the needs are very enormous. We have continuously called for the unimpeded entry of humanitarian assistance to enter to Gaza and for it to be distributed safely to people wherever they are. We continue to make this call, and the ICRC stands ready to scale up its response.
It's been said that 600 trucks are needed every day to get into Gaza to meet the basic needs of the people there. Do we know at this stage what sort of level of aid is actually getting in terms of numbers of trucks?
We don't really know exactly the number of trucks that's coming in, but the number of trucks is a distraction because 100 trucks, 200 trucks is not going to be enough. What we really need is an unimpeded, unrestricted entry of humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. And we need it to be delivered safely to people wherever they are. And it's also not just about the amount of aid that's coming in, it's also about the kind of aid that's coming in. People need more than flour, they need more than wheat, they need more than water in order to begin the reconstruction of Gaza and to give people the opportunity to rebuild their lives and to do more than survive. There's a whole range of very complex material that needs to be allowed to enter.
Okay, so once the aid gets into Gaza, what's the mechanism for distributing it across the territory?
Well, the ICRC has decades of experience working in conflict zones around the world. We deliver aid impartially. We deliver aid safely to people wherever they are. We have teams on the ground in the Gaza Strip, in Gaza City, in Deir al-Balah, in Rafah. And so the mechanism that we use is one that's according to our fundamental principles, and it's one that distributes aid in a way that upholds the dignity of the people that we serve.
It's believed that up to 400,000 people could still be in Gaza City. That's a place that hasn't had any aid deliveries for several weeks. Would that therefore be a priority area for the ICRC?
The ICRC has already started expanding its presence in Gaza City. On October 1, we had to suspend operations in our office there because of the intensification of military hostilities. But we have recently reopened our Gaza City office. We currently have teams on the ground. As an organization, our priority is proximity to the population. And because we want to stay close to the people we serve, we have teams in Gaza City who are ready to provide assistance, and equally importantly, we're ready to provide support for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, who are our partners.
Do we know anything about the condition of people in Gaza City? Do we know, for example, whether they're in a markedly worse situation than people in other parts of the country, or is there no such information?
I think that for everyone throughout the Gaza Strip, the conditions are extremely dire. Houses have been destroyed, hospitals have been destroyed, there's little access to food, there's little access to water. So I think we are talking about a general situation throughout the Strip that is very catastrophic. That applies to Gaza City because Gaza City has also been very heavily impacted by the recent intensification of military hostilities, but it also applies to many other areas throughout the Strip.
Throughout this conflict, we've interviewed people on both sides, and repeatedly we heard from Israeli officials this allegation that aid was being stolen and therefore they would restrict it entering Gaza in the first place. Is it still something that is being reported, the security of aid, for example? Are these aid trucks being intercepted? Are there attacks? Is there anything like that that you've heard?
The ICRC can only speak specifically about its experience, and we have not seen any major looting of our assistance or our aid.
Since the beginning?
Yes,
okay.
And our hope is that with the increase of aid coming into Gaza, with the increase of deliveries, that the level of desperation would decrease. And so people will have enough supplies.
Okay. Obviously, for aid to get into Gaza, there has to be a road, and some of the roads are clearly damaged, destroyed, or covered in debris. Is that something, is road clearance, it sounds like a very obvious question, but is that an actual hurdle to getting aid into the Strip?
Road clearance, the destruction of roads is a hurdle for all operations, all our operations in Gaza, and not just the entry of humanitarian assistance. This is going to be a massive challenge, and there's not a single actor that can do this alone. Our teams try their best. We have logistic experts, we have experts in weapons contaminations, but what we really need is to see a concerted effort, and we need local authorities to have the support and the supplies that they need in order to carry out this enormous task.
Obviously, there have been huge diplomatic developments in the last week, 10 days. Has any of that translated into an improvement, albeit a slight improvement, for the living conditions for people in Gaza?
I think the conditions in Gaza today are so dire that it's still going to take time before we can see an improvement. We have shortages of stocks that are going to take time to recover. People are still moving back to their homes and to their towns and to their cities. There are still people who have gone back and found their homes reduced to rubble. So I think we're still in a stage where it's too soon to speak of recovery. There's a lot that still needs to be done. And there are humanitarian organizations on the ground, including the ICRC, that have made it one of their main objectives to help people begin this road to recovery.
We're now mid-October. Temperatures go down quite sharply in the next couple of weeks, really, and November, December, and into January, you can see the temperature even below zero. How is, what preparations are being made for the winter? And given that 80% of homes and houses have been destroyed in Gaza, I mean, clearly shelter is going to be a major issue. What provisions need to be made for the winter?
Over the past 2 weeks, we have brought in shelter items. We have brought in blankets. So we're bringing in supplies in order to equip the population with the basic elements that they need. But this is not enough. We really need to see a scaling up of assistance so that communities and people, many of whom have lost their homes, many of whom are displaced, can have just the basic necessities for dignified living, especially as conditions get really harsh with winter and temperatures dropping.
Now, where the ICRC has played a really unique role, a different role to a lot of the other agencies on the ground, you were involved in the handover of 20 living hostages on Monday. How did that go? Did it go smoothly on the whole, that process?
The return of the living hostages is a source of relief for the ICRC. We were able to reunite families. These are families who have spent nearly 2 years in an agonizing nightmare. The fact that we were able to facilitate these reunifications is a big relief for us. We are also relieved that we were able to bring back more than 1,800 detainees, and we were able to return hundreds of families on that side. And so this moment really speaks to the fact that neutral humanitarian action can save lives, it can change lives, but we need the parties to reach an agreement. When the parties reach an agreement, families are reunited, and we are able to bring people back together.
Are you able to say anything about the condition of the people who came back into Israel? Obviously, there have been reports in the media, but anything the ICRC can tell us about what sort of a condition those 20 were in?
One of the top priorities for the ICRC is to respect the privacy of the families and to respect the dignity of all those in our care. And for that reason, we do not speak about the conditions. That applies both to hostages but also to detainees.
What were the biggest challenges of that operation to bring those 20 people back into Israel? I mean, presumably there were changes of vehicle, changes of teams on numerous occasions. I'm not asking for specifics, I'm sure you can't give them, but overarching challenges, what would you say they were?
This operation is a very complex operation. It requires meticulous planning. It requires a lot of work on logistics, on security. As you mentioned, the roads in Gaza are destroyed. Some are also littered with unexploded ordinances. We had to mobilize ICRC teams from across the world, from as far away as Kinshasa and Bogota, in order to reinforce our teams that are already on the ground so that we have enough people to carry out these operations. We deployed health professionals to make sure that we can have medical care provided to those who need it. We had to coordinate with all sides. And throughout the process, our main priority was to ensure the safety and dignity of all of those in our care. This will always be a big challenge, and we are relieved that we were able to bring all of them back home safely.
Okay, so you're making it sound like it was, at times, quite a dangerous operation.
Any operation, any release and transfer operation, and that applies to Israel and the occupied territories, but also across the world, there are always challenges. And we will always try our utmost as an organization to work through these challenges in order to ultimately secure family reunifications.
Now, where we are today is in a situation where, that transfer of living hostages has taken place. Now, the questions are about the 28 bodies that were stipulated in the peace plan as being people that had to be handed over back to Israel by Hamas. That was supposed to happen on Monday, and it's partially happened, but it hasn't fully happened. What's the reason for that not having happened as was expected?
We cannot speak to the parties. The ICRC's role is to facilitate the return of human remains as per the ceasefire agreement. It is the obligation of the parties to find the remains, to collect the remains, to evacuate them. We can only act as a neutral intermediary in cooperation with the parties. So we cannot really speak to the reasons for any delay.
Tell me a bit about that operation in terms of the logistical support, expertise that the ICRC brings, the resources that are needed. How does something like this happen?
The ICRC works a lot on the dignified management of the dead. It's one of the core things in our mandate. And we want to ensure that all remains that are entrusted in our care are handled with dignity. So we provide body bags to make sure that the bodies are preserved and properly labeled. We provide refrigerated trucks in some instances. And so really what we try to do is to make sure that all of the material and equipment is there to ensure a dignified transfer. And then we also speak with all sides, and we have the trust of all sides to be able to carry out that transfer.
And clearly, looking at pictures of Gaza, so much destruction. There are multiple different statistics to how to measure the amount of rubble on the ground. You know, it could fill up Central Park, 13 times the pyramids of Giza. Given the amount of rubble on the ground, I mean, has that played a part in complicating the process of locating the remains of these deceased hostages?
Again, it's not the ICRC that's responsible for locating or finding the remains. For us, we will not give up. The families of the deceased are not going to give up, and we're not going to give up either. We're going to continue to do everything that we can to ensure that we can bring human remains back to their families for dignified burial. We will continue to do our utmost, and we will continue to work under the conviction that we can get the job done. And this is what we're doing. We continue to carry out these sensitive operations. We're committed to continuing to carry them out, and we hope to see this through.
And Israel's saying that if this doesn't happen, and if those bodies are not returned, they're already threatening and carrying out their threat to switch off the supply of aid. What are the consequences of that going to be for the people of Gaza?
The people of Gaza today need an uninterrupted, unhindered, and unrestricted flow of aid into the territory. As we mentioned earlier, they need food, they need safe water, they need medicine. So it's very imperative that they have access to the basics to live in dignity. And we have continuously called for this aid to come in, and we hope to continue to see it coming in at scale.
In terms of the logistics, obviously Gaza, much of it destroyed, clearly a more dangerous place in the world to do something like this, and to, for the reasons we've been saying, repatriate the remains of those people. The ICRC was also involved in the return of 360 Palestinian militants who were killed. The first group of 45, I believe, handed over on Tuesday. So clearly a lot more still to be repatriated. Was that process more straightforward, given that it was going in the opposite direction than the Gaza operation?
Logistically, the remains of 45 deceased is a significant number. So we had to bring in refrigerated trucks in order to ensure the proper management and that they're contained in a proper way. We had to deploy personnel to carry out the transfer. There is no straightforward operation. There will always be challenges with the transfer of human remains. But again, as we do with the hostages, we will continue to do our utmost to ensure that the remains of deceased Palestinians are brought back to their families for dignified burial. And this is also a key priority for us, and it's also an essential element of the agreement.
just lastly, since the 7th of October 2023, the ICRC has facilitated the transfer of 172 hostages, 3,472 Palestinian detainees, and this ongoing process of repatriating human remains. How does it feel to work for an organization that, under incredibly challenging circumstances, has managed to remain neutral and effective?
We live in a very polarized world. And what the ICRC has managed to do this week shows the value of neutrality. Neutrality in action. When you have neutral humanitarian action, you can reunite families and you can bring back the deceased for dignified burial. There are very few actors that can do that today, and that's one of the unique added values of the ICRC. And this only reinforces our commitment to our neutrality. And it really shows us that when we commit to neutrality, we can yield results.
And presumably you have a great sense of pride to work for an organization like that.
Of course.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed, Hashem. Osseiran, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to come and see us.
Thanks.
We can bring into the conversation Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas. He joins us from Washington. Greg, you're not overseas today by the looks of things. Just wanted to start by asking you, though, clearly a lot of headlines again about the peace process, the 20-point plan, and what stage we're at in that plan. Let's start by talking about the hostages, the deceased hostages who have not been returned in the numbers that it was expected at this stage of the plan. I mean, do you think this issue of deceased hostages not being returned on time could derail the whole plan?
Great question, Tom. I don't think so. I don't think it's as important, obviously, as the release of the hostages that were still alive. And that was obviously the biggest part of this peace agreement, the most important. And I think, that you have to understand, I think there has to be some realism here that many of these dead hostages, they might have no idea where they are. They could have been killed 2 years ago or 2 weeks ago. It's really difficult to nail that down. So I think Hamas actually telegraphed that pretty well in last weekend before even the live hostages were returned. They sort of indicated in different ways that it would be difficult. So I don't think it's a deal breaker. I don't think it will, unless there's some blatant, some blatant aggressive action to purposely not return the bodies. But if it's just because they're difficult to find and there's some logistical hurdles, I don't think it derails the deal at all.
Right. So, I mean, clearly a place like Gaza, where 80% of structures have been reduced to rubble, and some of the key decision makers in the ranks of Hamas, for all we know, might no longer be alive, and they may have been the last people to have known the whereabouts of those deceased hostages. So you're saying that you think there is perhaps an element of understanding from the Trump administration on this particular issue?
Yes, and that's not to suggest that it's not important to get those bodies back, and it is. But I do, think they understand in a realistic way that, as you pointed out, Tom, much of the leadership of Hamas has been eliminated already. So it's, and then of course you have the underground tunnel network, and then all the buildings that have been destroyed. This might be a difficult phase. I don't think it compares to the actual 20 hostages being released on Monday, and B, the fact that disarming Hamas and the difficult situation internally in Gaza, I think those are much more important issues right now.
President Trump, though, striking quite a stern tone, wasn't he, yesterday when he issued that warning to Hamas, either they're going to disarm or they're going to be disarmed. He wouldn't be drawn on any of the sort of the possibilities of what the US might do in such an event. But what are your thoughts? What's the message he's trying to get across?
Well, I think he's pretty clear there, that they must honor the terms of the agreement. And as he said, they can disarm themselves or they can be disarmed. And that's not dissimilar from the threats that he made before the agreement was signed. And that's really one of the things that got Hamas to the table. Was not only was it the Israelis taking out Hamas leadership in Qatar, but also the fact that the president basically said we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And I think the alternative was quite obvious. So I think he's just reiterating what he's already said in the past. I don't think it's terribly earth-shattering that the president would view it as such. And so, good for him for making that clear.
I mean, there are people that we've spoken to who've suggested that, although some great achievements have been realized in the last couple of days, notably the release of the 20 living hostages, a lot of the hard work is still ahead. I mean, is that the sense that you get from where we are in this issue?
Yes, Tom, and that's definitely the sentiment here in Washington. Is this is a great moment, and I think there's a lot of optimism, but there is a lot of hard work to do. These peace agreements have always been dicey in the Middle East, but I think there's much more optimism than we've ever seen. I mean, this is greater than the feeling around the Camp David Accords a generation ago, any of the agreements in the past, whether it was Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter. I think both Carter and Clinton we're not given enough credit for those, but we also understand that there's a lot of challenges in there. But the optimism is really robust here in Washington, and I think in the media overall, partly because the president really brought a coalition. It's not just the president acting unilaterally. He has the support of the neighbors, the Arab neighbors in the Gulf. He's got the support of leadership around the world. You saw that on display in Washington on Monday, or actually in Cairo and Tel Aviv, or Egypt on Monday, and Tel Aviv, as well as and Jerusalem, as well as in the back here in North America yesterday. So there's a lot of momentum right now.
Right, and you mentioned President Clinton there, and he's actually been in the headlines the last few days for praising, together with former US President Joe Biden, praising this 20-point plan and the fruit that it has borne so far. I mean, is that an indication, would you say, of overall bipartisan support for what the president has been doing?
Yeah, without a doubt, Tom. And you're seeing it from many on the left. And I think they're wise and generous to do that. It reminds me in many ways of 2011, I believe, when Osama bin Laden was taken out, was eliminated by the Navy SEALs, that with authorization from President Obama. You had much support of, virtually universal support for President Obama from the right, from the Republicans. You're not seeing it universally right now, and I think it shows, how out of touch the Democrats are in many ways. But it's great to see both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and many others in leadership supporting and applauding President Trump. You're even seeing it from left-leaning media in the U.S., which is, again, very refreshing, but it's not universal. And you saw, Anthony Blinken yesterday, the former Secretary of State, trying to make an argument that this is really, Biden's blueprint from his administration. It's completely absurd. So I think, you will see some people on the left that just can't bring themselves to support President Trump like we did President Obama back 10, 15 years ago. But I do think, generally speaking, Tom, the support is overwhelming from both Democrats in America as well as leadership around the world.
What sort of coverage is this getting in the United States? Is this front page news? Is this at the top of all the talk shows there in the United States? Has it been for the last few days?
It really is. I mean, it's both on, the left-leaning media as well as, of course, the right-leaning media and the mainstream media even. They can't, it would be really difficult to not give President Trump credit here. And they look really silly when they do. And I think, I mentioned Anthony Blinken, former Secretary of State. You do have some left-leaning media that just can't bring themselves to do it. But I think that's the exception rather than the rule. There's a lot of positive energy here in the U.S.
Some are saying that this 20-point plan could serve as a useful blueprint for other conflicts around the world. And Ukraine springs to mind. In fact, it's been mentioned in that context. What are people saying there in Washington, Greg?
Yeah, again, there's optimism. It doesn't mean that it will be easy, but even the president in his remarks on several occasions this week has said, perhaps this is a blueprint, maybe not in those exact words, but, he kind of jokingly said to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Russia's next or Ukraine is next. So, yeah, I think that, this could be a blueprint. There's no doubt that the President Trump has proven that he is a peace president. He's an anti-war president, and yet not afraid to use force if it will lead to peace. And you saw that with taking out the Iran nuclear program back in June. So he will respect the red lines that he draws. He'll respect the threats that he makes. And I think the smart ones are the adversaries that actually understand that and choose peace rather than having their facilities blown up like they did in Iran.
Yeah, you say President Trump is the peace president. He didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize this time, but I mean, let's put the clock forward, 11 3/4 months. I mean, do you think that with these efforts that are being made, and presumably by next year there'll be considerably more results to show, do you think he'll be standing in good stead to be the 2026 recipient?
I think so, Tom. I can't guarantee it because, I think the committee and the Nobel Committee in general, is obviously very much anti-Trump. They're very much, for net zero, for example, things that they disagree on. Mass migration, I'm sure they're quite supportive of. So, these are some things where they might not be able to overcome that. But unless things change dramatically, you have overwhelming support. I think there's been some criticism, even from the left, that the Nobel Committee ignored Jimmy Carter, they ignored Bill Clinton, and yet they gave the award to Al Gore, long after he was no longer vice president. And of course, President Obama, which, back in his first term when he had barely taken office when the nomination was made. So I think on one hand, it probably was bad timing for President Trump. The nominations are in January, and the decision was made before the Israel-Gaza peace agreement was made. On the other hand, that didn't stop them from giving the prize to Barack Obama when he had done virtually nothing for world peace at the time. But all that being said, I think next year, we can say water under the bridge. Next year, it would be really difficult for the Nobel Committee to ignore what the president has done.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you. Greg Swenson, Chair of Republicans Overseas. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Well, we can speak now to Mohamed Abu Sada, who is an associate professor of political science at Al-Azhar University, who is currently based in Cairo. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor. Really appreciate it. What's your assessment of where we are right now in the whole peace process?
Well, many thanks, Tom, for hosting me. I guess we are still in the beginning of the so-called the implementation of the Trump proposal for Gaza. Over the past few days, we have seen the implementation of the first phase of the Trump proposal, which meant the release of all Israeli hostages alive, and Hamas has handed a number of those deceased hostages. In return, Israel has released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and the entry of humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. But I think we're gonna wait the negotiations for the second stage of the ceasefire, which will mean the deployment of international stabilization force in Gaza made from Egypt and Jordan mainly, and also the establishment of a Palestinian technocratic committee which will run the daily affairs of the Palestinians, schooling, health, municipal services, and the like. But I think what we have heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu today while he was speaking to a U.S. media outlet, he said basically that there will not be negotiations on the second stage unless the last Israeli deceased hostage is returned back to Israel. So it might take a few days or maybe weeks until the last Israeli hostage is returned back to Israel, taking into consideration the rubble, the destruction in Gaza, and some of those hostages are under rubble, basically.
Sure. I mean, Professor, it's easy to imagine why and how this is logistically a very complicated operation, locating and repatriating those deceased hostages. But do you think this issue of the deceased hostages could derail the whole ceasefire deal?
Well, let's hope not, first of all. But I know that this is not an easy issue. I know that the Israelis would like to see their loved ones returned back and buried according to their religious, basically, and Jewish tradition. But in the meantime, we have to take into consideration that 2 years of war and left more than 80% of Gaza destroyed, a lot of rubble. And I think the Turks are sending their own team today into Gaza to try to help locating those bodies. Taken again into consideration that the Turks maybe have a good experience with locating bodies as a result of the quakes that hit Turkey many times. So it probably Hamas is going to need the help of third parties, the Turks, the Qataris, maybe the Egyptians, to help with digging those bodies out and send them back to Israel.
Right. I mean, clearly the rubble is one reason why these bodies are going to be hard to locate, perhaps. But do you think another part of it is that simply the people who knew where the bodies were located have themselves perhaps been killed? Is that a possible explanation?
I totally agree with you that maybe some of the hostages guards were dead, or some of those people who basically abducted those Israeli hostages and were guarding their bodies, because we know that some of those hostages were killed because of Israeli bombardment. So some of the guards were killed with them. Now, but let's hope that Hamas, who was capable of providing protection for the 20 alive hostages throughout the past 2 years, taking them from one place to another place, will probably be able to know whereabout. But I think, again, the most of probably the dead hostages will be recovered. However, I know it's going to be a difficult thing with some of the hostages, taken into account that one of the bodies which were returned back to Israel yesterday was not an Israeli hostage, and it was basically a different body. So it's gonna take some time, and it probably, again, it's gonna take a lot of technical support from other countries to help doing all of this difficult work.
Right, and in the meantime, Israel threatening to cut supplies of aid into Gaza, which is, of course, urgently needed aid. But they have also said they're going to reopen the Rafah border crossing. And I'm just wondering, how much of a difference will that make to the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Well, Tom, that is definitely a very good question. Let me say that last night, when Hamas was retained only 4 bodies, the Israelis thought that was not the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire agreement. And then Hamas last night handed another 4 bodies. As I mentioned, one of them is not an Israeli. And that's why Israel basically retreated back and allowed the entry of supposedly 600 trucks of food and humanitarian assistance today. But I think they delayed the opening of Rafah crossing, which was supposed to be opened in both directions today. I believe the Israelis are saying that there are logistical issues. The road that connects between Rafah and Gaza, between Rafah and the Egyptian side, have been completely destroyed. And I think there probably need to be some kind of maintenance, reconstruction, or logistical support in order to make the Rafah crossing operational again. I think it's very much understandable that after 2 years of war, that the crossing itself, the departure and arrival hall of the Rafah crossing has been destroyed. So some work has to be done there. But I think, I hope that the Israelis are not taking that just an excuse to continue to block the entry and departure of Palestinians, especially that there are hundreds of Palestinian sick people and injured people that need to be treated in Egypt and other countries once this crossing is open.
Sure. Well, the Palestinian authorities have said they're prepared to operate the Rafah crossing in the event that it is reopened. But just talking more broadly about the Palestinian Authority, I mean, there are people saying that the Palestinian Authority is in need of major and far-reaching reform. And I'm just wondering whether you agree with that and whether you think the PA can have a role in Gaza's future governance without that reform.
Well, Tom, definitely this is a murky issue here. If you look at the Trump peace proposal, it speaks about reforming the PA according to the Trump peace plan of 2020, and also according to the letter that President Mahmoud Abbas sent to the Egyptians and the Saudis before the convening of the two-state solution conference in New York. I don't think that the PA will be able to do these reforms very quickly, but I think in the absence of the deployment of the so-called international stabilization force in Gaza and not to allow Hamas to operate in Rafah, I guess that makes it inevitable to allow the PA to operate, some of the PA employees to operate Rafah from the Palestinian side. Now, I don't think it's going to be any problem at the Egyptian side, but maybe we're going to see some kind of a problem on the Palestinian side. So if Hamas isn't allowed to do that, so basically the PA will have to assume some kind of responsibility on the Palestinian side of Gaza for the operation of the Rafah crossing. Otherwise, that will take a lot of time for the deployment of the ISF force into Gaza to do that. And I don't think that part of the mandate of the ISF is to work in Rafah. We know now that according to the agreement signed between the PA and Israel back in 2005, a European mission was deployed after 2005, but left the crossing after Hamas took over in Gaza of the summer 2007. I think a UN mission will be deployed also inside the Rafah crossing to facilitate the movement of passengers in and out of Gaza.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Mokheima Abu Saber, thank you very much indeed, sir.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
We can speak now to Aaron David Miller, who is a former Middle East peace negotiator who joins us now from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure having you on Al Arabiya English. President Trump has declared the war in Gaza is over. On Monday, he said a new and beautiful day is rising. Now the rebuilding begins. He also says phase 2 of the 20-point plan has started. Do you share his assessment of where we are right now?
Look, let's be clear. What we have and what we don't have. We do not have a peace agreement. What we have is a remarkable moment by an American president in an effort to break a two-year conflict in which Israelis and Palestinians have visited huge parade of horrors on one another. There is no inexorable end, no inevitable end to the war in Gaza. But what the president has done in phase 1 is to begin to diffuse the 3 reasons why anyone really cared about Gaza to begin with. One is the release of hostages, 20 live Israeli hostages, assuming Hamas complies with the other requirement to identify, locate, and return the bodies of those hostages who are not alive. That issue is going to be diffused. Second, end of the war permanently. My own read is this, that Hamas released hostages because they came to the conclusion, perhaps under Arab state pressure, the Qataris and the Turks, Muslim and Arab state pressure, that holding the hostages basically guaranteed an inevitable, inexorable, comprehensive Israeli military campaign. What you're going to see, I think, is a dramatic diminution of Israel's offensive military operations against Rafah, Gaza City, Khan Yunis. And if that is the case, then you could see a flooding of the zone of humanitarian assistance. No more exploitation by criminal gangs and elements, no more self-distribution, and no more inflated prices of food and other commodities on the black market. So the first phase of this, I think, will take an enormous amount of pressure out of and diffuse the urgency with which the international community, the region, viewed the Gaza. Whether or not it will bring an end to the war depends on tackling three major problems, which at the moment seem to be extremely difficult. Number one, demilitarization and decommissioning of Hamas's weapons. Number two, the deployment of an international stabilization force to maintain security and law and order. And three, to create a legitimate and authoritative Palestinian governing structure. Those are going to be difficult issues to resolve. But if Trump demonstrates the same resolve, by the way, I worked for presidents of both political parties, Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, and I'd throw in Biden and Obama as well. No American president, with the possible exception of Dwight Eisenhower, brought the kind of pressure on an Israeli prime minister on an issue that he deemed, the Israeli prime minister, deemed vital to his politics and to his conception of Israel's national security. So if Trump can continue to deliver that, I think this actually might work.
Okay, so you're saying the momentum is there, but the hard graft perhaps still lies ahead of us.
Absolutely. I mean, I've attended, I don't know how many peace conferences, celebrations over the course of 25 years or so of working on this. The hardest moment for any would-be mediator is the day after, when people sit around and ask themselves the hard questions. How do we actually make this work? Jimmy Carter, having brought Sadat and Begin to Camp David, right, in September 1977, within 3 months of that historic agreement at Camp David, within 3 months, the Egyptian-Israeli peace process was in crisis. It required, and Carter was one of the three presidents before Trump to address the Israeli Knesset. He did so in March of 79 during the course of a historic trip to try to convince the Egyptians and the Israelis to sign what they would ultimately sign later that month, an Egyptian-Israeli peace. So no, if Trump isn't prepared to own this, to embrace it, to invest himself in it, it's not going to work.
President Trump sounded like he was losing patience with Hamas, particularly on this issue of the deceased hostages' remains being returned to Israel. He issued a threat to them as well, saying either disarm or be disarmed. And on the other hand, looking at what Hamas has been doing in the last 24, 48 hours, they've been carrying out public executions of people deemed as collaborators or other types of criminal in Gaza. They seem to be saying, we're not going anywhere. What do you read into their actions these last couple of days?
I mean, look, I think Hamas was convinced, and remember, who are we talking about here? I mean, most of the senior veteran leaders are dead, including Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Sinwar, so many others. Decisions are being made by military commanders, Izzedine al-Haddad, the brigade commander of Gaza City, and others. The external leadership has pressed them to accept the possibility, and the Arab states have weighed in as well, that if in fact you release the hostages, your freedom of action in Gaza would actually expand. And nothing over the last 3 days has convinced me that argument is wrong. Not only are they seeking retribution against key clans and individuals, Abu Shabaab, that they believe are collaborators, they're deploying their administrative control over areas that the Israelis have redeployed from. I mean, who is giving the orders to deploy thousands of civilian police into these areas? It cannot be done without Hamas acquiescence. And when the president says, look, as far as I'm concerned, I wish Hamas would give up not only control of Gaza, and basically Palestinians would be able to elect. You'd have elections in Gaza and the West Bank. But the reality is when the president says, if you don't disarm, we will disarm you. I mean, what are we talking about? The state of Israel, with probably the most powerful military in the region, has spent the last 2 years deploying thousands of its forces with its own intelligence apparatus and sophisticated weaponry and AI and all of it. They have not succeeded. What is Trump going to do? Deploy 50,000 American special forces to occupy Gaza and clear, hold, and build? Hamas will have to make some accommodation. Is it their personal weapons they're being asked to give up? Is it dismantling the tunnel infrastructure and their laboratories that create high trajectory weapons and IEDs? They'll play along to the extent they can. But if you want to undermine Hamas, you're going to have to somehow find a way to empower an alternative Palestinian leadership that has real credibility on the streets and can deliver the security and prosperity in Gaza that Palestinians have so long been denied. And on the West Bank, you're going to have to empower a leadership that is able, largely through negotiations with an Israeli government that was willing and able to end the Israeli occupation. If you can't do that, then Hamas is not just going to survive. As a consequence of Israel's annexationist policies on the West Bank, it's going to thrive, and it's going to seek to take over the Palestinian national movement.
Right, and you seem to be suggesting, as many have as well, that the PA is not necessarily up to the job, headed up by Mahmoud Abbas, who next month will turn 90. I mean, what do you think is the right way forward for the PA? Clearly, they need reforms. What do they need to do?
I mean, look, why is the PA so feckless? Why has it been stripped of its credibility? Why, according to Khalil Shikaki's polling, is it in single digits when you talk about Mahmoud Abbas in comparison with other Palestinian potential leaders like Marwan Barghouti, for example? Yes, the PLO has to some degree self-destructed, but it's also a consequence of Israeli policies as well. The Israelis have sucked out and undermined the credibility of the Palestinian Authority since its inception. I don't know how to solve the problem of the Palestinian national movement now confronts, but it is a crisis because the choice that Palestinians are faced with, Hamas on one hand, Mahmoud Abbas on the other. And it's really not a choice, is it? Because Palestinians are denied the possibility of actually doing the choosing. I don't know. I wouldn't insult your intelligence and that of your viewers and listeners by suggesting that somehow I have a prescription for revitalizing the Palestinian national movement. I will say this, though. For all the transgressions that the Israelis have committed, settlement activity, land confiscation, closures, targeted killings, acquiescing in settler violence, and even terror. The one challenge the Palestinian national movement has not been able to overcome, and something it has to overcome, is the problem of one gun, one authority, one negotiating position. Arafat had it. When we went to Camp David in July of 2000, I was one of the 7 or 8 Americans as part of that negotiating team. That was the last time a Palestinian leader had credibility, legitimacy, and if he chose to exercise it, which at times he did and at times he didn't during the Second Intifada. But Arafat had the capacity and the power to impose on using his own security forces. You need a Palestinian leader or leaders who can have a monopoly on the forces of violence within Palestinian society. One gun, one authority, one negotiating position. If Palestinians had that, and you had an Israeli leader, which you do not have, willing and able to take Palestinian concerns seriously on the 5 core issues that we struggled with at Camp David, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims. If you had an Israeli and Palestinian leader and an American mediator who was prepared to be reassuring when necessary and tough at other times, you could actually envision it, of a conflict-ending solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we don't have any of that. That's the problem.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and analysis with us. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.